but thank you all for joining today. Um, Before we get started, the first thing I want to kind of talk about the intent of these webinars that we're having. What we're doing is we're doing mostly knowledge sharing with the PM and PMO community. Last month, we're basically talking about different aspects of the PMO for the next maybe 6 months or so. Last month, we talked about how to make sure that your PMO is delivering the perceived value and making sure that your PMO can thrive and survive in today's environment. And that went pretty good. We had Americo from the PMO Global Alliance on. We also talk about a couple of certifications that a lot of PMO professionals can get as well, like the Excelos P30 PMO certification, as well as the PMO Global Alliance certifications. I think it's called PMO CP. And there's another one they have coming out here pretty soon. But if you do lead a PMO, there are certifications out there with different frameworks that can help you with designing and setting up, implementing and running a project management office. If you need more information, please feel free to reach out to me. This month for September, we have Stacey Cellier, and Stacey is going to talk to us about something I think is very unique. We're talking about the different PMO structures, and she's going to talk to us about the temporary PMO, some of the best practices, case studies, benefits of setting up a temporary project management office. And next month, actually, to that, we are going to have for our October webinar, Jack Walzer. Jack Walzer is a PMO executive director as well as an author, and he's going to come on and talk to us about how to lead complex projects and programs. Currently, he leads the complex and large programs for the largest health insurer company in the US. He has a portfolio budget of over $200 million. So he's going to come on and talk to us about some of the best practices, some of the tactics and strategies you can use for designing and implementing a PMO, or specifically for large and complex programs. That's going to be pretty good. And he also wrote a book. He's an author of a book called The Agile Thinker. So he's going to talk to us a little bit about that as well. And as far as the podcast for October, we're going to have Sheila Anshantuyi. Sheila is a career coach and a business transformation leader, and she is also a project manager. She led pretty large projects for a health insurance company as well. And she's going to come on and talk to us about how to prepare for a project management interview, how to make sure your resume is arranged and set up in a way to where it can get through a lot of the AI and the screening process and some other things. So I'm excited about that as well. So that is for October. Now for November and December, we're going to take a break for the holidays, and we will return with our webinars in January. And in January, the first webinar we're going to have is we're going to talk about value stream management. For those who have Agile PMOs and you're using frameworks like SAFe, one of the biggest gaps today is companies figuring out how do we fund value streams. So we're going to have a guest on in January to talk to us about that. And then we're going to do a little bit about more along the lines of having an Agile PMO. So that's coming up early next year. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started actually. And I really want to welcome Stacey. Stacey, thank you so much for joining us. Stacey is the Chief Strategy Officer of Carter Inc., and she is a PMO thought leader. She has been setting up PMOs for almost 20 years now. She is a fantastic woman. I've had the pleasure of getting to know her. So, Stacey, I'm actually going to turn it over to you, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, Xavier. I appreciate it. And I am very much looking forward to those other topics as well. I was able to join the last one and got so much out of it. I really appreciate you doing that for all of us as practitioners, to bring us together every once in a while and have us talk through hot topics to make us all better. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate being invited and here with you today. So Xavier said we're going to talk about the application of a temporary PMO and why PMOs don't always need to be permanent to be successful. I won't go into a ton of background, but just so to give you some context of my experience with project management and PMOs, I have been a PMO leader. I've established PMOs in healthcare, government contracts, consulting, and then PE-backed mid-cap companies. I was we had the great benefit of being awarded the 2019 Global Awards USA PMO. So we were selected in 2019, the PMO that I ran then, to represent the United States and the PMO Global Awards. And we were top 8 in the Americas. Great experience. If you're not familiar with the Global Awards, I would encourage you to go check it out, look at it. There is so much content, and it really is the best, I think, sharing platform globally for PMO maturity and just to see what's going on really around the world and in all different areas of PMO application. So check that out if you have an opportunity. 20 years of experience in PMOs, leading projects directly. So starting off as a project manager, I've directly led clinical initiatives at Tenet Healthcare. I've been a program manager as well for a global product security company. And as Xavier said on the introduction, I am also on the strategy side of things now. So that's where I'm coming from when we talk through what we're looking at from a temporary PMO perspective today. What I want to talk through with you is just a little bit of definition setting. What are we talking about when we say PMOs to level set? Perceptions and trends, the modern PMO today, and then when to consider a temporary PMO. And I do want to make sure we have time for discussion. I always find this a very rich conversation and different people's perspectives and where they're coming from, and when a temporary PMO may or may not make sense. And people usually land on one side of the fence or the other from an opinion perspective. So I'm excited to hear what you all think, and if this brings anything new to your toolkit today to think about maybe applying a temporary status to your PMO. So first of all, let's talk about what is a PMO. Is it really just a state of mind? I would say the definition of PMOs are kind of like opinions and, let's say, noses. Everyone's got one. There was actually a 2016 study that identified 47 different models for PMOs. I was surprised that number was that low. I feel like there's probably even more if you drill down another layer into the research that was done on that study. And that can really be a challenge for all of us as practitioners. When leaders come to the table with perceptions and prior experience with a PMO that may or may not have gone well, may have functioned similarly or differently than what you're trying to do in your organization. So understand the challenges there and applaud all of you that can get through that life cycle with leaders and making sure they understand your function. I picked a few definitions here that I thought were helpful for context. So the PMBOK says the PMO is an org structure that standardizes project-related governance, et cetera. I find that definition very dry. The Wikipedia definition is sort of similar. Group or department within a business, government agency defines, maintains standards. And then I love this one, not really, but the Gartner glossary says a project management office is usually created to solve a specific problem, generally the IT organization's inability to deliver projects on time, on budget, and in scope. I thought that was pretty aggressive. So anybody want to tweet Gartner while we're going through this presentation and give them your opinion on their definition, feel free. But anyway, there's a ton of them out there, and there is no one size fits all answer to what is a PMO. My working definition is a PMO is an org structure function that enables all stakeholders to work together to better achieve common goals. You can get much more complicated than that, but I think at the end of the day, that's our role in organizations, is to bring that, to bring people together to work better, faster, more efficiently to achieve something together. PMOs are also, again, in my opinion and in the research that I've done, competency driven. So it requires domain expertise and knowledge of a similar size, scope, and function to be effective. And it does require some subject matter, business, or industry expertise. You have to understand the context of the business that you're trying to apply a PMO to, I believe, in order to be successful. And that goes for the department level, functional level as well. And it needs to be centralized. A key criteria that I use and look at when I'm talking about implementing a PMO or the function of a PMO is that it can't be performed elsewhere in the organization. It really needs to be its own function, and it requires cross-functional engagement. So you're really more of a neutral body, helping all stakeholders equally come together. As we all know, there's a range of PMO types. You can be at the enterprise level, which I equate with strategic. You can be divisional, functional. There are project-specific PMOs that manage large initiatives, and then you can be serving as a project management center of excellence and really aggregating best practices. And I'm adding another definition here to this, in that you can also have an outcomes-based PMO. So I'm using that in the swapping out for temporary, in that an outcomes-based PMO is limited in scope, temporary, there's a defined end to it. So that's kind of the working definition that we'll use as we go through the rest of this presentation for the temporary PMO. But perception-wise, and I'm sure you all are very familiar with this data and the statistics around the failure rates and success rates of PMOs in general. But according to APM, the 50% of PMOs have failed during the first 3 years of their existence. And the PMI also reports that 90% of large enterprises still have active PMOs. We're all familiar with this cycle. You start it up, they disband it, they start it up again, they disband it. It's very, very common for that life cycle to exist within organizations. Even though there are 90% of large enterprises still have active PMOs, counterintuitively, it's found the presence of a PMO actually reduces senior management satisfaction. And there's a lot of research that says that a PMO actually has no effect on the overall success rate of those projects. So I've asked myself a lot over the last several years, does it have to be failure? What is behind some of these statistics when they say a PMO lifecycle of less than 3 years is equivalent to a failure? And there's a lot of other research around this, but I really want us to think through if PMOs could achieve a higher success rate if they're designed with the end in mind. So deciding to deploy a PMO is a huge decision. It's a huge investment. It's an organizational, operational, major change. So I'm hopeful, hopefully I'm giving you some context to be able to ask the question of should we, if you're thinking about starting up a PMO. Just as with any other function, we need to offer just what the company needs, nothing more, nothing less. So when we talk today about, I want us to think about the best approach to implement a PMO if it has a defined beginning, middle, and end from the outset. So to me, an outcomes-based PMO is a temporary PMO that's focused on achieving goals and outcomes of a significant initiative that requires competency, structure, or communication channels that don't currently exist in the organization. That's a very simple definition, but I think it could be really powerful if you use this as a decision-making and filtering tool as you go through assessing whether you need a PMO and whether it needs to be a long-term PMO or a limited or outcomes-based PMO. So the three questions that we should ask ourselves when we get this request to, or the organization is thinking about implementing a project management office. Does the competency required for this effort exist in the current team? So you could have a PMO, but with this initiative or this effort that's coming up, is the competency there in that team from a subject matter expertise experience? Does it exist? Or would it be easily augmented or added to the existing team to accomplish the goal? The second question we should ask ourselves is, does this effort require any special or unique centralization or communication? Again, that doesn't already exist. Is this such a different and unique effort that it's going to require us to create new communication channels or create a new centralization that, again, doesn't exist in the current PMO, and the current PMO structure isn't easily adaptable? And then the third and really the big question is, does the need for that expertise, experience, and centralization persist after this effort is completed or delivered? So with that, let's think through some possible times when an outcomes-based PMO makes sense. There is, of course, M&A activity, and where you have integration or realization of that mergers and acquisitions activity that is going to be different than what your existing PMO or a new PMO may be expected to deliver. Another time that an outcomes-based PMO is going to make a lot of sense, in my opinion, is if you're in a growth stage organization. So you're in a company or there is a tremendous growth step that's happening. You're preparing for sale, or you're in the post-transaction period of the organization, where a lot of activity is required on either end of that transaction. There's also transformations and transitions, which is where I practice right now in that transition effort. For example, at Carter, we help hospitals get into new facilities. So say there's a replacement hospital, and you're leaving one hospital and you're building a new hospital across town. We help that hospital make that transition from one place to the other. That is a temporary effort, and it is a major transition for the organization, and requires a project management office, requires centralization, requires coordination, requires specialized skills that may not exist in the existing PMO. So we set up a standalone PMO to help pull all of those channels together to make that transition happen. But typically you can think of those, if you're using a filtering system or a decision-making system for this, think about if it's a major system redesign or any activity or effort that's going to be irreversible. You're changing the fundamental structure of something, either the organization as a whole or within the organization.
Stacey, I'm sorry, I have a quick question for you. So
yeah,
I know you're mentioning that, where outcome-based PMOs make the most sense, but I'm curious to know, are there specific industries where a temporary PMO will work best, or even some where a temporary PMO will not work at all?
I think that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think it's more about the outcome. What is expected of the PMO that is being established, and what do you need it to do? I think a temporary versus a permanent nature could apply really across the board. It's just thinking about how long do we need this, and what are we really trying to get to here, and not jumping straight into the full. We need a permanent PMO, and setting up a permanent PMO structure, which may live out its life cycle more quickly than the team that's building it may expect. If that makes sense.
That makes sense. That makes sense. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. The fourth area here, and I want to talk through each of these and get a little more into the let's check the boxes and make sure that this all makes sense to us. But it's the clean up and stabilize PMO, which I think really applies to PMOs that get started, and then we use the word fail, where they are disbanded, shut down, and then eventually started up again because maybe we got too fast out of the gate with a permanent structure. So we'll talk about that a little later on. But there is chaotic and messy, or we're starting up a PMO, you can apply a temporary status to that effort and have an end to that set up part of the PMO, and then move it to a more ongoing operational function. So if we think about the M&A application of our outcomes-based PMO, I think this is an area that really needs focus, and I'm not sure if any of our attendees today are in on an M&A side or are going through this. I would love to hear. But there is a tremendous failure rate. I mean, we talk about the failure rate of PMOs. I think we need to be looking over there on the M&A side of the fence, because the failure rate is at 70 to 90%. They don't meet the expectations that were set when they made the decision to create the merger or the acquisition activity. And in this HBR article, and there are many others, it really comes down a lot of times to integration, how to integrate them. And these companies they bring in consultants. There are usually teams of people that come in that work on this integration of two organizations or two companies, and a lot of times it's a cultural disconnect, and the two sides can't get through that. But I'm a big believer that if you had a PMO from the start to help bring all of those things together, set the goals, have a common understanding of the hows, the whys, who's going to do what, and communicating. I think that adding that level of expertise to your toolkit of folks that you're bringing in to help you through that M&A, I think we would see the success rate a lot higher if we, as a practice, applied PMOs to mergers and acquisitions activities. But it checks the boxes. Competency driven. You need someone in that team, in that PMO team, and on that in that part of the organization that understands the activities, the sequencing, what needs to happen to make that integration, to realize that integration. It needs to be centralized, and you can define an end to when are we done with M&A activity and when do we hand over to operations. I think one question we probably would ask ourselves is, is there a persistence to the PMO structure within, if you're working on M&A activity? And I think there could be. I think during that process, you really are bringing teams together. It's a great opportunity to think about what the future of the organization looks like from how are you going to manage projects? Do you need a PMO? If so, what kind of structure would that be? Should really be an outcome of M&A activity. So I think there's a temporary nature to it, and could also persist. And then there's the growth stage organizations. Again, there's a lot of misses here in practice for growth stage organizations, both preparing for themselves for sale. So there's a ton of work that has to happen when an organization is getting ready to put themselves on the market. And there's a need for, again, competency driven, centralized, and there's a definable end. You're getting yourself to a sale. And often that expertise is not going to exist in the PMO. It may be adjacent to, you may have a sub PMO that's focused just on those activities, but I think this is a great application for that. And another thing that organizations don't sometimes fail to think through is the post-transaction activity that needs to go on. So especially in the private equity world, if you've been purchased, gone through a private equity transaction, there's often a lot of work that happens on the operations side, things that they're advising you that you can do better, change, modify in the organization. And I think preparing yourself for that and having a PMO structure that will carry you through that post-transaction activity is something to really think through. And then, of course, transitions and transformations. This is, I guess, probably goes without saying. I know a lot of you are probably experiencing a lot of transformation activity right now. But the question of, does that sit in the PMO, or do you have a separate PMO setup that focuses just on a transformation activities? McKinsey studies, also find that fewer than a third of organizational transformations succeed. And I wonder how much of that is because there isn't a PMO that's dedicated to making sure those things move through the organization in a focused way. And then we get to the hot topic, the clean up and stabilize organization. My quote here could be any CEO on any given day. It's impossible to get things done. We need a PMO to manage the chaos. I'm sure many of us have been there before. Projects, the information isn't getting to executive leadership. Everyone's busy, but we don't know what they're working on. All of the things you hear that are usually the catalyst for we need a PMO. And there's research and there's just, I think, something for us to really think through instead of the knee jerk, let's go put a PMO in place and jump right into the tools that we have that exist now, and here's how you start a PMO, and here's how to make sure you're setting yourself up to deliver value. I think all of that is fantastic, absolutely needs to be done, but there also is the case for let's set this up in a temporary nature, especially if things are very chaotic or you don't know where the power dynamics within the organization are going to fall. So setting up a PMO and at the outset without understanding how it's going to be accepted, absorbed, et cetera, within the organization, I think creates a ton of challenges that can be avoided if it's defined in the beginning as this is exploratory, we have cleanup to do, we are going to address the immediate needs and concerns that we have organizationally, and we are going to use this time to really define what we need and want from a PMO to make sure it's sustainable. So that's where I would start with those kind of questions. So is the organization looking for quick results? If the answer to that is yes, I think a temporary PMO makes sense. This is fast turn, fast results, not the right environment to establish a fundamental foundational system within the organization. And ask yourself too, is there an established PM structure to leverage? If there's a strong project management competency within the organization already that you can leverage, it may be easier to go into that, let's go through the full life cycle model. If there's not, again, I would proceed with caution on jumping into really chartering and authorizing a PMO that is expected to deliver long-term results. And then again, the power dynamics. Are there power dynamics, and is the authority clearly understood? Again, I'm sure as practitioners, we've all experienced that where you get this PMO to the rescue rescue sort of approach when you first kick things off, and then you find well, I'm not giving up that part of my team's role. I'm not giving that up. I'm not going to be told what to do. I don't want to lose my PMs. There's all that we have to deal with and go through to really hardwire PMO into the organization. And if that's not really clear, again, I would start small and make sure that all gets worked out, and then launch yourself into a long-term.
Stacey, I have a quick question for you. Sorry.
Sure.
So when it comes to staffing a temporary PMO, how do you typically staff it? Do you use FTEs who are already in the company? Do you hire new PMs, or do you do staff augmentation and use like a staffing company to staff your temporary PMO?
That is a great question. I think if we go through, just scroll back here for a minute. If we think through each of these scenarios, and there are more, I'm sure there are a ton more, and I'd love to hear if there are questions or other ideas about how this could be applied. But growth stage, if we just look at these in turn, in growth stage, I think you're going to be challenged to, if you hire permanent employees, because there's really this is a bolus activity. So you need someone to come in and help you get things done, but then at some point you're going to normalize those operations, and you're going to have overhead that you're not going to be able to utilize, because you're going to stabilize. You're going to go through this cycle of high intensity, and then again stabilize. So I would say consulting or bringing someone in to help you get that done, and then turn that back over to the operation makes sense there. Transitions and transformations, I would have two different answers for that. Transitions, I think again is a temporary team. That's consulting. That's bringing people in that have deep expertise in how to transition from one state to another. Transformations, I think, lend themselves a lot more to a more permanent structure, and having internal resources do that, because there is such a need for ownership of the end result there with the transformation. You're learning as you're going. That knowledge really needs to stay within the organization to sustain that transformation effort. And so I think you can look to internal teams and resources. You may need to augment, of course, for SMEs or project management support there, but from a leadership perspective and an ongoing PMO director, project management role, I think you can have a more permanent structure there. The cleanup and stabilize could fall either way, really, depending on kind of how dicey the situation is. Sometimes you may need, because you get builders and operators, right? And so if you really need a builder to come in and help you get through that clean up and stabilize phase, and then they transition it to someone that's permanent, that moves into more of the operating the PMO, I think that makes a lot of sense. It can be done with an internal resource start to finish, but I think that separation makes a lot of sense in that role. And then with M&A, I think you've also got a good opportunity there to have a team that, again, there's a bolus, and you are going to need outside help to help you understand what all the moving pieces of an M&A activity demand. But that can absolutely be done with an existing PMO director, really kind of arm in arm. I think they can help also guide that group through the dynamics of the new organization, and they're going to need to understand that going forward as well.
All right, thank you.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Thank you so much.
Awesome. You're welcome. You're welcome. I've provided you, and I guess we'll send this out, and Xavier, there are a couple of, if you want to read more on this, if this is something that you feel really applies to your situation, or you just want to think more about, again, those decision criteria as things come up. Does this really need to be permanent? Can we stand up a temporary PMO? I've got a couple of books here that I highly recommend. And then, I also encourage you all to look at the PMO value ring. I think that methodology can be applied in general, just to think through what is this PMO, even if it's going to be temporary, what is it expected to deliver? How do we understand and frame the results that we need, the structure that we need, et cetera? I think it's a great application. You just need to tack on that. When does it end? How does it end? How does it transition then back into the organization? And you'll be in good shape. So in conclusion, I think in order to deliver big work, we need to separate longevity from success when it comes to defining, was a PMO worth the investment or not?
Great,
With
thank
that,
you.
I'd love to hear questions, comments.
So I know we do have one question in the chat from Jeannie. Her question is, what is the difference between a large program structure and an outcome-based PMO?
A large program structure and an outcomes-based PMO?
Yes.
I think it's really the size of the organization and where it sits. So I'm thinking of this. You may have a program that operates much like a PMO within a very large organization. But for those that are thinking of starting a PMO or have a PMO that, again, wouldn't be able to, with the existing competency and capabilities and structure, absorb a program under it, I think having a side-by-side or separate and independent PMO makes sense.
All right, thank you. If there are any other questions, please feel free to type your questions in the chat window, and we will make sure that your questions get answered. But while we're waiting, I do have another question for you. So when you look at setting up a temporary PMO, where does it typically sit within an organization's org structure?
These kind of efforts are generally going to go to top leadership. So if there's transformation, transition, M&A, think about those scenarios. They're usually going to be at that CEO, COO, C-level leadership team. But again, I think if there's an existing PMO structure, the more we can tie those things in together and have them work side by side or coexist, so we're not confusing people, the better.
Okay, thank you. And we do have another question from Sonia. Do you tell the organization that the PMO is, oh, sorry, we have two more questions. Okay, so Sonia, do you tell the organization that the PMO is temporary, outcome-based? If yes, who? Executives, people managers, the entire org? What are the benefits and potential pitfalls of this messaging? That's a good question, actually.
That's a really good question. So do you tell people that it's limited? Absolutely. Just like a project has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I think having everyone understand that this particular structure will end and what that looks like and what we're all working towards the outcome to make sense. Especially, and it sounds counterintuitive, but again, I encourage you to do the further reading on this. But it's counterintuitive to say we're going to start this PMO temporarily and then ask people to buy into it, right? Because it's temporary, I don't have to worry about it, it's going to go away. That's the inverse actually happens, though, is that people are able to better adjust and adapt and feel like they've provided feedback and have had input into what this is going to look like and do for us as an organization going forward. Yeah, it actually kind of has the opposite effect that we think it would have if we say it's temporary. And it also helps leaders understand that it is a big change. A lot of times, we use the word pain. You'll feel some pain. It's going to be, we're going to have to develop some new muscles, and you don't do that without putting in the reps, but letting people know that we're going to go through this really challenging part of getting ourselves cleaned up and stabilized and defining what our PMO does going forward. But they know it's finite. They know that what we're going through right now will end, and then we'll be in a steady state. Did I answer both parts of that question?
I think you did. Stacey, Sonia, if not, please chime in. And we have another question from Ronald. One question I have is related to the research around the longevity of the PMO. Besides leadership support changing, what are other reasons the research points to the high turnover of these PMOs? That's a good question.
That's a great point, and I don't know that we have time to cover it all right now. If you go to Bill Dow's book that I put in the further reading, he lists 40 reasons that PMOs fail. And from my perspective, I think, in my experience and what I've seen in the PMOs that I've started up and shut down, is that we have a knee-jerk reaction sometimes to want to to apply a PMO, and we go higher and we build without really thinking through what are we trying to accomplish. Again, the PMO value ring is a great resource and tool to help you think through the rationale for the PMO and what it's really supposed to do, and making sure that there is full buy-in across the organization to what you're trying to do. There's something to be said for rethinking and constantly evolving the PMO to match and meet the business needs. And I think that's another big reason for failure, is that we have this governance and control sort of approach sometimes to a PMO that becomes a little too rigid, and the organization will just bust out of that if we go too long with those with kind of that restrictive nature in place. So not evolving, focusing too much on governance and control instead of results and outcomes. And I think the leadership question and losing your sponsor is something Americo, I know, feels very passionate about. If you get a chance to listen to Xavier's last webinar with him, we get into that a lot too on that one. It's a great conversation. I encourage you to go through.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another question from Elaine. When the temporary PMO's role ends, does some of that power to make decisions transfer to the project manager?
I think that's I'm going to give you the lawyer answer. It depends, right? I think it really does depend on the application that you're talking about here. If it's one of those like I currently do in a transition effort, once you're transitioned, you're kind of done, right? If it's M&A activity and there are things that you're changing within the organization that needs ongoing project management, absolutely makes sense. And those are things you got to map out in the beginning to know what you're trying to get to on the other end.
Thank you. We have another question from Akil. Are there any baseline guidelines to decide onto the size of the temporary PMO body based on metrics like revenue, market size, etc.?
That is a really good question. I don't think so. I think that would be a great thing for us as practitioners to have, but I don't believe so. The three references that I've given you here all have good guidelines for thinking through whether you need temporary or permanent and decision-making criteria for those structures. So I think you can use either one of those, the books that I've referenced there, to guide you through that decision-making process. But I don't think there are any hard and fast rules.
Okay, and there is a second part to that question, and then we have, I think, one last question. The second part of that question is, in a lot of cases, explain like growth and M&A, the consultancy companies like BCG, McKinsey, et cetera, are quite instrumental. So they act as temporary PMOs, or they are part of a temporary PMO. Any examples or specific cases at the top of your mind?
I would say yes, they are, and I have I've gone through this myself, being on the inside, especially of these of the growth efforts and in some large transformation projects. And I agree with you to an extent that they will come in and serve as the PMO. I would love to see us not use them as the PMO. I think it needs to be an independent group. We need autonomy, and we need to be seen as a separate organization that is for everyone. And again, that does it need to be centralized, and I think having the consultant also running that entire ship doesn't produce the best outcomes from in my experience. I would love to see an organization implement a separate PMO that they feed into, and everyone else in the organization that has other work streams that may be outside of the specific work that the consultants are doing, to be able to feed into that as well.
And one last final question.
No offense to any, if you BCG or anybody's on the phone, love you guys, but yeah.
One last question is, how is it that the organization, I'm not quite sure, give a temporary PMO massive control, but not the FTE committed PM? What is the real reason for lack of confidence in the organization and not allowing the PM to do their role?
Can you state that back to me one more time?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
okay.
Sorry about it. I was trying to read through it. How is the organization? I'm trying to, because I think one of the words is misplaced here. How is it that the organization give the temporary PMO massive controls, but not FTE committed project managers? What is the real reason for lack of confidence in the organization and not allowing the PM to do their role?
That's a great question. And that gets more, I feel like that's more into the permanent PMO sort of setup, and when there's not buy-in or confidence in the project managers. And again, that's a big broad topic. For a temporary PMO, I wouldn't say there's massive control. What we're going for with the temporary PMO is, again, bringing that competency that may not exist within the organization, bringing that centralized communication structure to the effort to make sure that everyone understands how things are working and what's expected of them. We're facilitating, we're bringing best practices, and we're helping move the organization through what is kind of a bolus outside of normal operations.
Thank you for that.
So the power doesn't, there isn't power, I would say. There is, it's just additional, it's a set of responsibilities that are needed for that effort.
All right, thank you for that. And then just one final question. I know I said that was a final, but just one more.
It's okay.
So because I know when you're setting up a PMO, it takes a lot of work. You have governance, you have to figure out what functions you need, you have to figure out expectations, and that typically takes some time. So when you're setting up these temporary PMOs, both setup and disbanding a temporary PMO, how long does that typically take?
That's a great question. And so if we just focus on the cleanup type of PMO, and the others are going to run their life cycle dependent on what deadlines have been given for that particular effort. But you're not usually going to have a deadline with when are we done with the cleanup or startup phase of PMO. Give yourself a year to 18 months to really do the cleanup effort, understand what's needed within the organization of the PMO. I know that sounds like a long time to some organizations, but that's the right amount of time to really understand what are we looking at here and to set yourself up for success. You are accomplishing things along the way. You can do some triage work and get some wins and start understanding what capabilities and capacity you need from a project manager perspective if that's what you're going to do. But give yourself plenty of runway to get that credibility building done, and then to start off on your real PMO journey.
And so to that point, if you're saying a year to a year and a half to basically set up, make sure you have the right expectations, the right layout, the right governance processes and everything, tools, technology. What's the typical life cycle of a temporary PMO? Is it 2 years, 3 years, 5 years?
I think again it depends on the initiative. For a PMO startup, again, I would say keep that shorter, keep that in the 18 months or so period. And then, but what you're doing there is really cleanup. You are, doing some of that triaging, and then you're starting to stabilize then, and then you can really assess what do we really need. If you try to do that while there's still fires burning, it makes it really hard to figure out what do we really need. And you get running down a path that may not be the right level of PMO for the organization. The others, I think, run with the life cycle of the activity. For M&A, though, I would also think about the time boundary of that and what does done look like, because those could drag on for a really long time if you're not clear about what's the definition of done for the temporary.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Stacey. This
You're
was
welcome.
an excellent topic, as I thought it would be.
Hey.
Before we end the call, are there any other last minute comments that you would like to add or advice?
No, I just, again, I applaud you all for what you do every day. I think it's really, really important work. I think good, solid project management, PMO leadership practices really do improve organizations. So thank you for what you do. I love talking about this topic and PMO stuff in general. So I do have my contact information in here. If you have any questions or want to talk about anything, or I'm happy to chat. Shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you.
All right. Thank you so much, Stacey.
Thank you.
Just to let everyone know, the recording will actually go out no later than tomorrow, in end of day tomorrow. Depends on how long it takes Zoom to download the recording. Once I have that, I'll send it out. I'll also send you out the deck that Stacey has presented here, as well as links to the podcast, as well as the YouTube channel where you can go and you can actually watch this in person. And please share it to whomever you would like. And also, starting tomorrow, we will start promoting the October webinars and podcasts, which I spoke about earlier, which is leading complex projects and programs, and best practices for interviewing for a project management job. So those will go out tomorrow as well. And I really appreciate your time, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you here next month. All right. Take care, everyone.